Hello, everyone. I am Jim Hake. I'm the founder and CEO of Spirit of America, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to retired General H.R. McMaster. H.R. is a member of Spirit of America's advisory board. He was the 25th National Security Advisor to the President. He led the creation of a new national security strategy, which, especially at this point in time, was especially prescient with respect to the challenges and threats represented by the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. He is a native, as am I, of the great city of Philadelphia. And before our event started today, we were commiserating about the Eagles' loss to the Washington Commanders last night. So we won't be talking much about that today.
But how about the Phillies, Jim? What a hell of a season, man. You got a hell of a season.
Phillies, and we'll probably spare folks of the cheesesteak discussion, which we love to have as well.
And hey, anyway, Embiid is looking good. The Sixers look good. The Flyers look good. I mean, I know everybody wishes they were a Philadelphia fan probably right now.
Yeah, I think so. You know, for so long we've been disregarded and besmirched, except for that awesome Super Bowl victory against the Patriots and Tom Brady a few years back. And let's not forget the perhaps the greatest moment in sports history when the Flyers defeated the Russian Army team in hockey. So that was a good one.
Hey Jim, if we can not serious for a minute, I was national security advisor when they won the Super Bowl, when the Eagles won the Super Bowl, and that previous summer, Bob Kraft was flying with President Trump, and he said, "Hey, can you take a picture of us on Marine One?" Right? So I said, "Okay." I said, "Smile and say go Eagles." To those, to them. And Kraft said, I think they have a pretty good team this year. Well, it turned out they did. No,
it was a beautiful thing, and it will never be forgotten. We have some very serious Patriots fans here at Spirit of America, and I have used every opportunity, which is pretty much 24/7, to heckle them about that particular event.
Okay, I got to tell one more story on that too. Okay, Jim McConville, who's now the chief of staff of the Army, lived down the street from me, and he had this obnoxious Patriots flag flying, and it was Super Bowl week. So I get back to my house with my Secret Service detail. I go into my basement, got an extension ladder, went down. This is probably around midnight, and then or 11 o'clock at night. So I put the extension ladder up to take this off his balcony. The Secret Service guys are like, "Oh my gosh, our detail chief, Brent's going to kill us if something happens to you." But McConville was in his living room with his wife watching television, so I had to do it very stealthily. But I was able to get the flag, leave an Eagles hat in its place, and then ransom it on the neighborhood chat by text, holding it with a bandana around my head. So anyway. All right, that's the last Eagles related story.
That's the kind of Philadelphia spirit we all know and love. So it's really, really well done. And for everyone who joined us for this spotlight event, I don't want to disappoint you with future ones because there will not be as extensive a discussion of Philadelphia sports and culture and culinary delights as we have tonight. But I want to thank you for joining us, and especially I saw from the folks who signed up so many great Spirit of America supporters, and in fact, other members of our advisory board as well. In addition to being the 25th National Security Advisor to the President, General McMaster is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and the author of a book with possibly the best title ever. It's Battlegrounds, the Fight to Defend the Free World. And it's that fight that we're going to be speaking about today. As background, for those of you who don't know us, Spirit America is a privately funded nonprofit. We work alongside U.S. troops and diplomats all over the world to help them save and improve lives and spread American values. We're very active right now in Ukraine, Taiwan, Iraqi Kurdistan, Mozambique, and about 7 other countries. And again, General McMaster is one of our, not just because he's from Philadelphia, but one of our most beloved advisory board members, and a tremendous addition to our extended team. So HR, thank you for being with us again.
Hey, Jim, what a privilege. Anytime I get to interact with you or Spirit of America, I'm just so grateful for everything that you're doing. And I just love the fact that you're decidedly, not neutral because we can't afford to be, especially in connection with the competitions that are so critical to our future security, prosperity. And like all of us together today, we want to help build a better future for generations to come, and Spirit of America does that every day. So thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that greatly. As a housekeeping item, if you have questions, please enter them on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and we'll do the best. I'll do the best I can to moderate those and get them to you, General McMaster, today. For starters, with the national security strategy developed under your leadership, authored principally by Nadia Shadlow, who we both know well, you identified Russia and China as principal, as you put it, competitors at the time. And so in looking at the Russian Federation and what's happening in Ukraine now, let's start with, did you see that? Did you see this coming?
Absolutely, Jim. I mean, it's, some things in life are these black swans, right? Unanticipated events that have unforeseen consequences. The reinvasion of Ukraine in February of this year was a pink flamingo, as my friend Frank Hoffman calls them. These are quite obvious, challenges and problems that we just avert our eyes from. And I think, it's been clear based on the pattern of behavior from Putin's Kremlin almost since he took over in the year 2000, but certainly after 2003, when he poisons a Ukrainian presidential candidate and permanently disfigures him, and then goes on a sustained campaign of aggression against Europe and against the West broadly. Of course, inflection points in that competition were the denial of service attacks on Estonia, 2007, invasion of Georgia, 2008, and then, of course, the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So, it was clear really from what he had said as well, going back to last year, August of last year, he published this essay under his name that basically said, hey, Ukraine's not even a thing. They're only part of Mother Russia. He started the exercises in Belarus that telegraphed, and the mobilization of troops that telegraphed what would be the reinvasion in February. I mean, we knew it was going to happen, I think, and sadly, we didn't do enough to deter it or to prevent it. I think in many ways, what we did to allay Putin's concerns, Jim, you remember you kept hearing that. Well, we have to make sure, we address his security concerns, and we did all sorts of things, like green lighted the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, going against Congress's wishes. President Biden met him. I gave him a summit in Geneva. We extended the START treaty. We pulled our fleet out of the Black Sea, right? And so Putin wasn't concerned about his security. He was determined to restore Russia to national greatness, and I think that our failure to deter him with strength actually was provocative, right? Weakness is actually provocative. And I think we've recovered quite a bit since then, but I think there are important lessons from that. The failure to deter the reinvasion of Ukraine, I think, is instructive, especially in connection with the competition with China.
And what more should we be doing to help Ukraine win at this point?
Oh, Jim, I think we could do a lot more, right? And I think what we could do in particular is provide them with all the weapons they need to defend themselves. We saw the mass attacks last night, 100 missiles. We saw the missiles that fell in Poland. We don't know what the specifics of that yet. Could have been a Russian missile. It could have been a Ukrainian anti-missile as well, because as wars don't stay confined to one area, and you hear precision in front of anything in war, you ought to be skeptical, because, war is not precise in any way. So what they need, I think, to protect themselves now, is you see 80% of Lviv out of power now, 8 million Ukrainians without electricity because of the assault on Ukrainian power infrastructure, as well as the attacks on residential areas, are combinations of capabilities. They need longer range fires, right? I mean, we ought to just provide them with ATACMS. Because to have good missile defense, you have to be able to kill the archer as well as shoot down the arrows. The intermediate range air defense that we're expediting there, we should expedite even faster and get even more of it into Ukraine, and to begin to train them, obviously, and employ those systems. And then, of course, longer range surveillance capabilities, something like the MQ-9 Reaper, for example, and just pull out the stops, right? This idea that Putin's going to be provoked if we give him, this type of weapon, I think is a little bit nonsensical, as we see them continue the indiscriminate murder of Ukrainians with these missile strikes. And then, of course, we can do a lot more, I think, to prevent others from reinforcing Russia, in particular the Iranians. And I do think there are a lot of measures we could take, probably a lot we can't talk about here, but there are options, I think, to go after the Iranians as they resupply them with probably missiles now, but certainly with these kamikaze drones. and actions to take against China as well. More Chinese companies on the non-verified and on the blacklist. Chinese companies that are complicit in helping Russia try to cobble back together his war-making machine. We could create problems, I think, for Russia in Belarus, for example, to complicate his efforts, or in Central Asia, or in Syria, for example. I think we ought to really, at this point, be doing everything we can to create multiple dilemmas for Vladimir Putin. And of course, we ought to be contingency planning that if he does continue these mass murder attacks in an particularly egregious way, maybe with chemical weapons, or he's talked about a nuclear weapon, that we ought to have options, maybe, to impose costs on him that go way beyond what he might have factored in before he would use those capabilities.
And you've said that for there to be true victory and peace in Ukraine, there will need to be political change in Russia. And what would be a scenario or two, or what would bring about that kind of political change in the Russian Federation?
Well, it would be up to the Russian people. It doesn't look good. Like, the prospects are good now. I think, Jim, what's most likely, sadly, is that this war is going to continue for years. I think Putin, until he acknowledges defeat, the war goes on, right? I mean, there's no such thing as an off ramp for Putin, right? An off ramp for Putin is just the opportunity to look for the next on ramp. So it's important that he be convinced that he's been defeated. And this is why I think it's important to provide the capabilities I mentioned to Ukraine, as well as protected mobility and mobile protected firepower, so they can continue their offensive to retake the territory taken since February 24th. But also, I mean, I think to make Russian positions untenable on the Crimean Peninsula and in the territory that they've occupied since 2014. So what happens internal to Russia? It's really hard to say. There's been talk about, well, what if there's a palace coup? I think highly unlikely. And if anybody's interested in this topic, I recently did an interview with Vladimir Milov, who is a quite insightful Russian opposition figure on the podcast Battlegrounds, which is a long format interviews with world leaders. And what Milov said is, he said, hey, the problem is not just Putin. It's the revanchist nationalist class of people who've come in with him, right? This is his head of intelligence, it's Patrushev, it's Shoigu, and so forth. And they know if Putin goes down, they probably go down with him. So it's very unlikely that they would take him down themselves. By the way, Putin's built this huge security apparatus around him, Jim. I mean, he's 30,000 to 50,000 people in the palace guard. They're all vetted. He's very concerned about his own safety. When you see him at the end of those long discussion tables, that's one of maybe 12 studios, really television studios in the Kremlin. So he moves from place to place, so it's not predictable. He looked at really how Gorbachev went down and how communications got cut off to Gorbachev. So he moved communications into the palace guard and the presidential guard. He has a vast security apparatus across the country. Stephen Kotkin, who's a great colleague here at Hoover, he talks about authoritarian regimes don't need to be that strong. They just need to be stronger than any opposition, right? And so what Putin's really good at, and again, in the words of Stephen Kotkin, is demobilizing, right? Demobilizing opposition, fragmenting opposition. And so where you have a great deal of popular discontent now about the war, it's fragmented, and the FSB is very good at going after these people and just fragmenting them by arrests, by, Navalny being imprisoned as an example, those that they've killed, Boris Nemtsov and so forth, and others earlier. So, they're good at fragmenting the opposition. There are more political prisoners in Russia today than there were at the height of the Cold War. There are more people in Putin's internal security apparatus than there are in the Russian armed forces. And so these are not signs of strength, but again, he just needs to be stronger than any opposition. What Milov thinks is that over time, popular discontent is going to grow. The effects on the economy are starting to be felt, right? They just closed the auto plant outside of St. Petersburg. They're going to have big supply chain issues. There's going to be more unemployment. You have, of course, the vast casualties. I mean, at least 60,000 casualties, at least 20,000 killed in action. And of course, that's affecting families and the narrative that has been reversed, right? In the beginning, Putin said, oh, just a special military operation. Don't you worry about it. I've got this. Now he's going back to the Russian people and saying, well, maybe I don't have this. How about 300,000 of you mobilizing? I mean, that's, so that was a big shift. And of course, many of those were mobilized to leave the country, is what they did to avoid the conscription and coming back into service. And the forces that he's generating now are untrained. They're poorly equipped. A lot of the army that's deployed doesn't even have winter clothes, and winter kit. And so they're getting chewed up. The counteroffensive in the north, Jim, the one around Kharkiv, that regained 1,200 square kilometers of territory. That was the first wave of replacements. The so-called volunteer battalions, and they just broke and ran. So I think the Russian armed forces are on the verge of collapse, and that's going to reverberate into Russia. What you're seeing in Russia right now I think is important in terms of the far right pro-war bloggers are going after the military leadership, blaming the military leadership for the failures. They're at pains. It's really hard not to blame Putin, right? And that's good. And I think it's interesting that they're criticizing the Russian war effort. Putin can't remain immune to that for, I don't think, much longer. So what Milov says is that an important metric to watch is, what if the Russians just stop doing what the Kremlin tells them to do? I mean, what if he says, I need to mobilize 300,000 and nobody comes? He also said that what to watch is how so many Russians, and this is really important work, I think, for Spirit of America to advocate for, and all of us too, is when they start getting information from other sources of information other than the Russian controlled media. 30% of Russians who before the war got their information only from state-run television and other state-run media now get their information from other sources as well, Telegram channels, the internet. So I think a long-term objective for us has to be to poke holes in the firewalls of authoritarian regimes. And I think this is relevant to China and to North Korea and to Iran as well.
Yeah, and unwinding that kind of long-term propaganda is going to be a real challenge. One of our questions from the folks who have joined us is regarding corruption, and I wanted to ask, you were in the lead on addressing corruption in Afghanistan for the United States, and based on that experience and looking ahead to the reconstruction of Ukraine after the hoped for victory that we're all looking for and working toward, looking ahead to that reconstruction, based on your experience in Afghanistan, what would be some of your advice or observations on how it can be approached so to minimize the effects of corruption?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, transparency and accountability have to be built in from the beginning. And I think that this all alludes to a broader issue. There has to be a long-term plan put in place right now to help the Ukrainian economy survive and then grow and rebuild, after this devastating war. But we have to start it in the midst of the war. So transparency and accountability built in to all mechanisms of dispersing funds or contracting. Another key aspect is you need people on the ground, right? You need people who can verify that dollars spent are going toward their purpose. There are ways for digital auditing now that we didn't have years ago, right? That it can help tremendously in this connection, but you still need people on the ground to see the actual work and do some of the quality control. The other key thing is to incentivize honest, right? and efficient behavior, and behavior that is associated with being stewards of the resources and the reconstruction effort. For example, if there are a number of construction contracts or transportation contracts or whatever, that there ought to be rewards put in place that companies that do well, that deliver everything on time, that perform are actually rewarded, with additional contracts. There should be other mechanisms put in place to debar companies, to terminate for convenience while you investigate them, and then of course you need an insulated investigative and adjudicative body, to go after corrupt behavior. So I think that all those mechanisms have got to be put in place from the beginning. And you ought to ensure as well that contracts are not super empowering people of dubious backgrounds. I mean, this is in Afghanistan, Golag Ashurzai or the Popal brothers, or I can name 12 of them, who got a lot of these contracts, and we knew they're bad actors. I mean, what do we expect? So So I do think that it's a great question. I think the transparency and accountability has got to be put in place. And then, of course, what you want is you want budget execution, implementation, and all of this follow-up to be done through the Ukrainian government. So the transparency and accountability has got to be set up through, through the Ukrainian government, because otherwise what will happen is the Ukrainian government won't know what's going on around them. And of course, the US won't have the jurisdiction, to be able to go after individuals that are not, that are not adhering to the law, right? So it's been a problem in Ukraine, as everybody's known for years. But I do think we have to recognize that it's a big element of Russian propaganda too, right? To say, hey, these guys are so corrupt, your money's going to be wasted, your arms are being transferred. I mean, all that stuff is that the Russians have been putting out that we know is false. That'll certainly continue.
And one of the things we're getting started with is on a small scale is a more decentralized approach to community rebuilding and development in certain villages in Ukraine that involve the community itself and identifying needs and ultimately managing smaller amounts of money. So a more decentralized approach that can be I think, not a whole solution, but a part of it. So more on that later.
And I should say one other thing too, Jim. The good thing is Ukraine's a democracy, right? And I think one of the key elements of this is people who are well informed, who can put positive social pressure on the government, right? The Ukrainian government, to improve transparency and accountability.
Yeah. So shifting gears to the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, what do you think the likelihood of a military invasion of Taiwan is by the PRC?
Jim, I think it's really high. I mean, I would say, if you want to extend it out to like between now and 2030, say, I would say it's, it's well over 70%. And the reason is I think we ought to believe what these dictators say, right? And oftentimes, we consider primary sources from authoritarian regimes like secondary sources, and we pay attention instead to secondary sources, what is Graham Allison, who's a great guy. I mean, and I respect him tremendously, but we pay more attention to what he says than what Xi Jinping says. So we ought to listen to what Xi Jinping says. And I think what he's been doing is preparing the Chinese people for war. And you can see it in the speeches. They get declassified often years after they're given. And in one of these speeches to commemorate, the 75th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, he essentially went back to the Korean War and cast the Korean War, of course, as the Chinese do, as a war against American aggression. But what he said is that Mao Zedong delivered one blow to prevent 100 blows. He cast it as a preemptive war. And then in the next paragraph, he talks about Taiwan, and then talks about how the Chinese people have to be prepared to make sacrifices to realize the dream of national rejuvenation. And so if you take that, if you take other recent speeches, the speech just given at the 20th Communist Party Congress, he's saying he's going to do it. If he can't achieve what he would prefer, which is annexation by invitation of the Taiwanese, that he's planning to do it. And you can see it in the concrete plans that are being made, right? The ships are being built, the missiles that are being deployed. So, I think the big question, Jim, is going to be, can we win the race to reestablish deterrence by denial, right? Being able to convince the CCP and the PLA they can't accomplish their objectives through the use of force. And I do think that Xi Jinping is evaluating when he's going to do it. I think that you've heard some people say recently, I think it's sooner maybe than later. You heard President Biden try to reassure after the meeting with Xi Jinping, that he doesn't think he's going to do it. But, I'll tell you, I really think the danger is mounting, and the period of maximum danger is probably between 2024 and 2026. And the reason I say that is that there's an election in Taiwan in 2024, and there's an election in the United States, right? And, I think our domestic political landscape, I mean, I think we ought to be confident about our democracy. I think the midterms were an affirmation of our democracy, but it's ugly, right? Democracies are ugly, and I think the CCP may look at us in an election year and say, "Oh man, they're weak, right? They don't have the resolve." And then, of course, when the KMT fails to replace Tsai Ing-wen's party in Taiwan, when Chinese efforts at disinformation, at coercion, at buying off elites, at economic coercion, everything that they would do in Taiwan to try to reach their objectives short of war fails, then I think we see escalation toward what they demonstrated when Speaker Pelosi visited, a kind of a soft blockade, and maybe an effort to take over the airspace, and then maybe efforts to disrupt communications on the part of Taiwan. And of course, we know that would be a disaster for the Taiwanese and for the world economy. We go into a depression based on our reliance on Taiwan for microelectronics and semiconductors in particular. So anyway, sorry to go on about this, but I'm worried about it. I think we ought to be concerned about it. But hey, what do we do about it? I think what we ought to do is to try to do everything for Taiwan that maybe we wished we had done to help Ukraine between 2014 and February 24th of this year.
Well, one of the things that I'm just back, as you know, from Taiwan on Sunday night. And one of the things that we're doing is working on large scale citizen mobilization and preparedness. So the civilian piece of what will be a great complement to the Taiwanese government, military, and first responders.
Hey, Jim, can I turn the tables and ask you a question then? Okay, because you're just back from Taiwan, right? And if we think of deterrence as a simple equation of capability times will, what we see is a rush to get capabilities to the Ukrainians, but man, they have a lot of will, right? Ukrainian valor, courage has been extraordinary. I've heard, and you would know much better than I would, the Taiwanese will is on the rise because they're learning vicariously through the fates of Hong Kongers as well as the Ukrainians. What's your sense of Taiwanese will?
Well, it is on the rise in the war. Well, three things. One, increasing Chinese belligerence and aggression is one factor. Second is seeing what happened in Hong Kong. And then February 24th, the further invasion of Ukraine by Russia. All those things, the Taiwanese people are paying attention. So those are major factors in terms of it being part of the zeitgeist. A lot of the Taiwanese we talked to talked about I think it's just one at this point, but a heroic Taiwanese service member who went to Ukraine, fought heroically, and died as being an example for especially the younger generation of Taiwanese. That said, it seems to me to be much more of a generational and cultural issue in terms of how high the concerns are. So much more among younger people, say 20 to 35, than among the older generation. Not to put down people like you and me, HR, but one of the interesting things that I learned there was that there was a shift in education in Taiwan where the education, primary and secondary education, have been much more focused on China up until the year 2000. And since 2000, it's focused much more on a Taiwanese national identity, hence explaining some of the interest of the younger generation in preserving Taiwan's democracy, because there's a stronger identity there. Plus, younger folks are generally more activist to begin with. So it's mixed. And there are a lot of challenges where Taiwan is not Ukraine. The Ukrainians, because of the initial Russian invasion in 2014, had 8 years to prepare for February 24th. And that dynamic doesn't exist in Taiwan. So, from our view, there are a lot of things that, of course, have to happen for that kind of preparedness and ideally deterrence, as you said. But the one that we think is most doable for us to try to affect is a citizen and service piece, which is what Spirit of America is about anyway, but the citizen service and citizen mobilization part. So that if for example, if stated in the extreme, but if the PRC knew that the Taiwan people were united and ready to defend their country, whether that required taking up arms or not, that would be a deterrent. If they knew that citizens could communicate with the outside world, no matter what they did, no matter what China did, that would also serve as a deterrent. So those are, there are a lot of other things on the military side specifically, right. But we think those are some of the key factors. And you weren't supposed to be asking me questions, HR. But,
no, but you know better than I do on that. That's great to hear that perspective. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and a bunch of more questions that came in that I'd love to ask you, but we're out of time, including one question mentioning the Philadelphia's soccer team. So,
oh yeah, that's right. I should have mentioned the Union. It went down to penalty kicks. It was unbelievable. That was an unbelievable game too. God, anyway, LA got a goal in like right at the end. I mean, it was heartbreaking. Okay, yeah.
Well, so we got that question in, I guess. So,
all right.
Anyway, everyone, thank you for joining us. HR, thank you so much for your time. I know how precious that is, and it's an honor to have you part of the team here. Again, thank you.
Hey, it's an honor to be part of the Spirit of America team. Thanks so much, Jim. Take care. Great to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye now.